Israel is now planning to launch, as we speak, a ground attack in Gaza. Marginalization of Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian Authority will be a big challenge for the entire Israel-Palestinian engagement. It is very hard to conceive Hamas launching this kind of the scale of an attack without some support from Iran. The credibility of Hamas has gone up not just with this, they are seen to be the forces that can take on Israel's military might. India has a cultural connect with all its neighbors, which China does not have. There are important questions to be asked in Israel of Mr. Netanyahu, of the security apparatus, and of how Israel perhaps was being governed in the last few months. Apart from America that has called for India to join the investigation process.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. The world was shocked by Hamas's terror attack on Israel. This was the biggest terror attack Israel had seen in recent years, and Israel has decided to go all out. It's all hands on deck in Israel, and war escalates. So there seems to be no sign of de-escalation right now. But to put things in perspective, I'm joined by Professor Pant, and we will try to look at the problem in that area. Why did this happen? Was there also an intelligence failure on Israel's front? And what happens next? How does this war spill over? Are we going to be affected by it? So there are many questions. Harsh, to begin with, there is a complete siege on Gaza, and the Prime Minister Netanyahu has vowed that Gaza would be turned into ruins. We see smoke all across Gaza Strip. Thousands of people have been killed on both sides. Now, where do you see any sign of de-escalation? Right now, the world is in support of Israel, and Israel is going all out. What happens in that region?
Well, this is, I think, an extraordinary situation, Nagma, and I think it is going to take time before de-escalation starts, because the attack has been unprecedented, and this has been viewed by Israel as one of the most significant attacks that they have faced in recent memory, and of course they are describing it as war. Now the challenge here is that de-escalation can only happen if either of the two sides feel that they can, that there is something to be gained by that de-escalation. At the moment, both sides feel that they have leverage, that at least Hamas feels that they have leverage because they have hostages, and Israel feels that they have to do everything possible before the international community starts putting pressure on Israel to de-escalate. So I think in the short to medium term, we will see escalation before we see de-escalation. And that means that because Israel is now going all out in Gaza, it will also, it has launched or is planning to launch, as we speak, a ground attack in Gaza. We know how ground attacks in the past have panned out. Israel had to withdraw from Gaza in the past because of very difficult circumstances there, and the difficulty of fighting door-to-door, of doing door-to-door combat. So I think as this war, certainly this is just the beginning. We are going to see a few weeks, perhaps months of a very tough battle on the ground, and eventually I think once both sides have some sense of what kind of negotiations they can start, perhaps there'll be a de-escalation. But at the moment, a de-escalation doesn't look very likely.
Yes. So Harsh, let's put this in perspective. What led to this? Of course, it's been talked about that there was a huge intelligence failure. Excuse me. There was a huge intelligence failure on Israel's part. But what led to this terror attack by Hamas, and what's been the history of the region, the dispute over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and what happens to the Arab-Israel peace negotiations? Probably that would also be stalled for the moment, or maybe it was also done. This terror attack was also done because there were people who were not happy with these peace talks.
Well, I think certainly one can attribute the Hamas attack to some degree on the larger strategic change that the region was witnessing, and I think Iran, and along with Hamas, would have found it very difficult to come to terms with the normalization process that was starting, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So I think there is no doubt that the larger context in which American grand strategy in the Middle East was pushing for an Israeli-Arab reconciliation, was pushing for normalization of ties between particularly Saudis and Israel. We have seen the legacy of Abraham Accords shaping up in the region. So I think certainly for certain actors in the region, in particular Hamas, and to a certain degree in Iran, there'd be a lot of discussion about how should we retain our relevance, because ultimately it's a question of political relevance. Now, what I think Hamas has been able to do is through this extraordinary attack, and of course, this is one of the most unprecedented failures on the part of the Israeli security establishment. But I think what Hamas has been able to do is, in one fell swoop, it has been able to put itself at the center of Israel-Palestinian conflict. I think they have marginalized the Palestinian Authority, something that will have grave implications for the peace process in the region, whatever was left of the peace process, because Hamas as an entity which starts from the basic premise of the destruction of Israel cannot be seen as a credible interlocutor by Israel or by anyone else. So I think marginalization of Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian Authority will be a big challenge for the entire Israel-Palestinian engagement. But the reality is that the credibility of Hamas has gone up notches with this. They are seen to be the forces that can take on Israel's military might. And therefore, not only is now Hamas at the center stage of Israel-Palestinian engagement, but in some ways they have scuttled the broader process that was happening strategically in the region.
Yes.
And by doing that, they have ensured that that the Saudi and Israel normalization that was being talked about will not happen, at least in the short to medium term. Now, long term, we don't know what are the possibilities, but the kind of investment that had gone into this normalization is unlikely to happen. So, as tensions simmer and as public opinion in the region gets very polarized. So I think we are going to see a lot of turmoil in the region, and the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the Israel-Arab conflict has taken a very different dimension. And I think both Israeli military strategy and Israeli foreign policy strategy will undergo a transformation.
So if Israeli military strategy, Israeli foreign policy strategy will undergo a lot of change, then the question also is what changes in this region? How will the dynamics change here? And also, if I may bring in Iran here and also Lebanon here, so we cannot rule out the involvement, or can be, the involvement of Iran here, or because Hezbollah, of course, have been vocal about their support to Hamas.
Absolutely, and I think I think Americans have come out with a statement saying that there is no direct evidence. There is no evidence as of now of direct Iranian involvement, but it is very hard to conceive Hamas launching this kind of the scale of an attack without some support from Iran. And I think Iranians have made it amply clear time and time again that they are, that they support Hamas in ways that no other regional actor does. So I think in that sense, Iran, where we were earlier talking of Hamas coming to the center stage, in the larger strategic scheme of things, Iran is now at the center of this engagement, because Iran has also made it very clear that they would, they would do everything possible to scuttle the Arab-Israel rapprochement as it was emerging. So I think in that sense, Iran's centrality in the Middle East has once again been reinforced. And Iran has also made it clear to its Arab interlocutors that without taking Iran on board, there is not going to be a large Middle East settlement as was being envisioned before. So in that sense, Iran and along with Hamas are there at the center stage. And of course, Hezbollah, which of course is also seen as an Iranian proxy, is also now doubling down. We are hearing reports of Hezbollah also making it clear that they will launch attacks. And I think for Israel, this is going to be a huge difficulty given the two-front challenge that they will face, from Lebanon and from Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think that escalation will have its own dynamic, because Israel will have to then go in for major reinforcements. And as we are witnessing, American presence in the region, military presence in the region is increasing. American military support to Israel is increasing. I think the question that every Israeli military or security planner would be asking is that where do we go from here? We can escalate, we can of course launch ground attack, but I think Israel knows more better than anyone else the implications of that ground attack and how that kind of a ground attack in fact creates more problems than it solves. And that was the reason why Israel withdrew from Gaza in the first place, because it was becoming unsustainable. So I think as you see two-front situation emerging, as you see greater polarization in the broader region emerging, there'll be enormous pressure on Israel to de-escalate. But at the moment, given the domestic situation and given the shock it has given to ordinary Israelis, I think Israel therefore is perhaps is determined to go in all out in this conflict.
Absolutely. And from what I understand, the country that is standing here to lose is Palestinian and the Palestinian Authority. And like you pointed out, Hezbollah and Iran have gained center stage. Of course, America is right there with its partner and friend, USS Gerald Ford, is stationed there in the region. Now, just one last question before we move forward to another topic. What does this mean for Prime Minister Netanyahu? There is a big intelligence failure.
Absolutely. See, at the moment, certainly Israelis have rallied around the flag, given the challenge that they, given the shock that has been given to them. But I think serious questions will be asked of Netanyahu and the entire security apparatus, partly because Netanyahu's image of being tough on security, of being a hardliner on security matters, would certainly lead to a lot of questions. But it is also interesting to point out that that Hamas perhaps also read very carefully what was and very subtly what was happening within Israel. There was a lot of dissension within Israel. There was a lot of dissonance within Israel. You had even the security services challenging Netanyahu's approach. On institutional matters, for example, what was happening with the Supreme Court, and I think in that sense, the divisions within Israel also perhaps allowed Hamas to launch this kind of an attack, because Israel was consumed from within. It was consumed by the domestic challenges, and therefore the state authorities, the security apparatus did not perhaps had their eyes on the ball, that neighborhood. And I think this would lead to some soul searching. This is as big a deal as the Yom Kippur War 50 years back. And I think the shock will perhaps resonate more. And what is interesting here, Nagma, is that this was, if you go back 50 years, that was states attacking Israel. 3 states coming together. Here, this is a non-state actor, perhaps with the assistance of a state actor. But here is a non-state actor challenging Israel in a way that perhaps many Israelis had not assumed that they would ever be. So I think there are important questions to be asked in Israel of Mr. Netanyahu, of the security apparatus, and of how Israel perhaps was being governed in the last few months. And those questions will have their own impact of how Israeli politics and how Israeli society evolves. But I think at the moment, given the challenge of a war, it seems that for the moment we are talking of a national unity government. We are talking of all the Israelis rallying around the flag, and as the war escalates, I think the questions that Israelis will be asking of themselves would also come to the fore.
Absolutely. Right now, it's rallying around the flag, but then there will be questions, and there are questions being raised of how Israel was consumed in domestic politics, and why did this, and how could this happen when a non-state actor launched such a big attack on Israel. Now, amidst all this, we hear India-Canada diplomatic row continues, Harsh, and we hear that now Mr. Justin Trudeau has dialed UAE, and among other things that he's talked about, he's also talked about the India-Canada the diplomatic row. Now, this is in the midst of a snowballing diplomatic crisis between India and Canada over the killing of the Khalistani terrorist Niger. We've also heard that now Trudeau is saying that let's discuss this privately. But when he charged India with the killing of terrorist Niger, that time it was very loud and clear. So how do we see de-escalation happening sometime soon, or what is India's stand on this right now? And this India-Canada diplomatic row continues to escalate.
I think India certainly seems to be in a much stronger position at the moment, given that Mr. Trudeau has not been able to produce the kind of evidence that it was assumed he would have when he made the kind of allegations on the floor of the Canadian Parliament. So I think, in that sense, there has been an attempt, of course, by many countries around the world, in fact, some of Mr. Trudeau's closest allies, asking him to dial it down. What we have seen are some incredible allegations being made. What we have seen is the Prime Minister of Canada, making some allegations which have been, refuted strongly by India, and India continues to insist that none of the evidence that the Canadian authorities have been talking about has so far come to light, and that it is not India's policy to do the kind of things that have been that India has been accused of doing. So clearly, the ball is in Mr. Trudeau's court as to how he wants this to take forward. Now, of course, he's also trying to rally some of his partners, like you talked about UAE. But we know that in the past he has not had much of a success, apart from America, that has called for India to join the investigation process. None of the other Five Eyes have really come out and spoken about it. They have said, of course, the boilerplate statements have come out from all of them, but nothing of any significance, which perhaps puts India in a corner, has come out, and India has stood its ground. So as we look at this crisis, we look at two things. One, how will India, Canada get back to normal with Mr. Trudeau being the Prime Minister? Because there is clearly a sense that Mr. Trudeau is part of the problem, that his approach to India was never serious, was never sincere. And from the very beginning, while India was giving all the evidence, he was ignoring it. So whether there is enough trust now left with Mr. Trudeau in India with regard to Mr. Trudeau, that's a big question that Canadians have to answer. The other question, of course, is that India, for the first time, perhaps is also in a position to highlight the challenge that Canada poses on the extremism front. That, there has always been this idea that Canada is very open to all kinds of extremist voices, which have great, which can create a lot of problems, not simply for the world, but also for Canada and for bilateral relations that Canada has. Now we are seeing the evidence of that in the Indian case, and I think India can rightly point out that if you look at the history of extremism, if you look at Canada's flirtation with some of the more extremist groups and voices, the idea that freedom of speech is so sacrosanct that nothing can come in its way will have to be reassessed. And I think India has been able to perhaps educate some of its closest partners, like I think Dr. Jaishankar also mentioned this, that some of the things that India was telling the Americans, even Americans were not sure, Americans had not heard about. So I think clearly India is now has been in a position, because of this crisis, to underscore the challenges that India faces with regard to Canada when it comes to some of these very difficult issues that India has found very difficult to resolve, and the manifestation of that was found in this crisis.
Absolutely. The Khalistani terror has spread and escalated in Canada outside of India much more than it has done anywhere else. And with Mr. Trudeau being at the center right now, it looks a little difficult. You clearly pointed out that India, it's right now advantage India. India is in a position to also point out how Canada has been fanning these sentiments. Now, moving on to Maldives, that's also very interesting. We've seen the President-elect Mohammad Moizu, who's who's openly known as pro-China because his election campaign was India out. So does it really mean now China in and India out? Or, of course, there's a different position between India and China. India is very close culturally, linguistically, and geographically to Maldives than China is. So what changes here?
I think we will see some tactical adjustments, given that there is a new government which has been openly, avowedly pro-China in more ways than one, and has been challenging India's presence in the country. So we will see some adjustments to that effect here. I mean, the president-elect has made some noises about Indian troops, etc. Although Indian troops are not present there in any big numbers, they are just there to train the Maldivians. So in that sense, we will see a change. We will see a change in tone and tenor of the relationship. But I think broadly, what we are witnessing, Nagma, is that in the Indian Ocean, South Asian region, India-China contestation is becoming much more palpable. It's becoming much more explicit. Something that was behind the doors now is out in the open. And India will also continue to make a case to its partners in the region that India has equities, India has relationships, and as you pointed out, India has a cultural connect with all its neighbors, which China does not have. So while there can be other things that China can do economically, militarily, the fundamental fact of people-to-people ties with India will survive, and that means that India will always have a role, India will always have a stake, and India will always have a presence, despite the political parties of different stripes making a case that India out or India in. I think India will always be there. India can't be outed from the neighborhood, and that means that India's engagement will continue, and India's engagement will always be about about the people rather than the elites. So in that sense, India's engagement, if you look carefully across the neighborhood, it has always been about with the people more people centric than elite centric, which is very different from China's approach, which is always elite centric. So I think in that sense, India's engagement with Maldives will continue, and Maldives will also I think the new government will also learn that that you have to take into account Indian sensitivities and take forward your foreign policy. All the nations in the neighborhood, they have their own agency. They know how to work with multiple players in the region. It is to their advantage. But I think as China's clout grows and as India's ambitions grow in the region and beyond, I think the neighboring countries, South Asian countries, Indian Ocean region countries, will have to be more effective and in balancing these contending powers, and we'll have to ensure that in some ways, it's not as simple as India's gain, China's loss, or China's gain or India's loss. The story is much more complicated than that.
Both the countries have a strong presence here. And of course, as you pointed out, the nature is also different of India's engagement with Maldives. So India, of course, will have a strong presence there. And it's not as black and white as India out and China in, or vice versa. The contestations in the region are much more palpable. Thank you so much for all that analysis, Harsh. Of course, we'll keep watching the space for the Israel conflict that's going on, the Israel and the Hamas war that's raging, and we will bring you more updates on that from us on this episode of Ideas Factory. That's it for this week. Thank you so much.